Morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Today, we'll be engaging in a panel discussion surrounding built environment PI claims. At I2, we are extremely privileged to be involved in some of the most interesting and complex built environment claims, and we're even more privileged to be working so closely with industry legend, Mr. Martin Vass. We're honored for Martin to join us today to take us through some of his favorite claims. Martin is a structural engineer by profession and has overseen the design and implementation of various infrastructure projects in South Africa. Martin then moved into specialist liability space, providing valuable insights and advice on liability and quantum aspects related to claims arising out of the built environment sector. Also like to introduce you to our I2 claims experts, Nadia Shiba, and Stacey Lepan. And of course, I'm Kamini. I'm the PI claims manager at I2. So without further ado, over to Martin to take us through his first favorite claim.
Are you going to bring the photographs up on the screen?
Yes, can you see them?
I can see your introduction page. I can see it now. So do you want to go through a bit of background to this matter?
Yes, please, Martin.
All right. This was a solar plant in the Northern Cape, and it in fact was built by a Spanish company. And as you see here, there in fact are two plants here. The one in front is the one we are under discussion, in fact form part of the claim. And these are mirrors, and they in fact heat up tubes of oil, which provide steam to the turbines. So this is one way. The other way, of course, is photovoltaic, which is direct sunlight to power. But this particular one here is a solar panels heating up tubes. And we go to the next one, go to the next slide, Goni, which in fact shows a close-up of these. And you see them here. These are reflector panels with the tube running down the center of those panels. These panels rotate automatically and follow the sun during the day. So they slowly rotate over, and in fact will end up facing the opposite direction at the end of the day. Then overnight, they return back to this position and once again track the sun the following day. And what happened here, there was a design defect, in fact, in the rotation mechanism. And what was happening here, as the panels were rotating, they were wearing out the bushing and the shafts supporting every single panel. So in fact, what we had to do here was to lift each of these individual panels using a crane. Each panel is about 4 tons, lift up each panel and change out the shaft and change out the bushings on each panel. To give some idea, and you saw the size of the field just now, there's something in the region of 26,000 shafts and bushings which had to be replaced. That work started some months ago, and we've fact just finished now. We are finalizing the cost. I think the final cost will come out somewhere in the region of 40 or 50 million to change out these bushings. The claim was put under a PI policy, and the claim, after some discussion, was finally accepted by insurers. And in fact, that claim will be, in the next few months, that claim will be settled. We have paid a couple of interim payments in the meantime, and now we're close to finalizing this matter. Now, I think Carmody has some questions on this particular field. I think there's another photograph. I think there is one more photograph, Carmody, which shows those panels. Or do we go on to the next one in the meantime?
There's just one more photograph.
Yes. That's somewhat. There we are. And that photograph there shows the close-up of the rotation mechanism, which is in the center of those panels, and driven with electric motors, and slowly track the sun during the day. It's quite incredible if you get near those mirrors. The heat which is generated when those mirrors is absolutely intense. So it was quite an interesting project, not an easy one to get to. A lot of flying, a lot of driving as you get to the site. But we had to do a couple of visits to the site and discuss it with the contractors. So do you want to kick off now your question and see if I can answer it?
So Martin, what are the difficulties in dealing with single project claims, and how do they differ from claims made under annual PI policy?
You're asking a single project claim. Is that as though there is a single project policy in place, is what you're asking?
Yes.
Yes. I gather now the brokers listening, if any brokers listening, will know there's great problems now in obtaining any further single project policies. I think the insurers have stepped away from those, and they're only going for the one insured at a time, I think, is what's happening now. We prefer that, or we did prefer, if they're still in place, we do prefer the single project policies. And the reason why we prefer those is because we know then everyone is covered under this kind of umbrella and no one's going to slip out. We also know there is sufficient cover under those policies. So you don't have a sub-consultant with a policy of R1 million. Also, we don't know whether the premiums be paid on every policy. So we much prefer this kind of umbrella policy where everyone is covered. The only problem on those policies, of course, is sometimes the deductibles. Because the policy has been taken out by the client, he's not too worried about the size of the deductible. And we often have the problem that those contracts are not declared under the annual policy, and therefore the buy down does not come into force. So the insured, and obviously the brokers know that, they have to be declared under the annual policies. And what would often happen is we will assess the claim under the project policy, and then the annual insurers will approach us with a copy of our reports. And we then, if the lead insurer is happy, we then release our reports to the buy down insurers. So we prefer the project policies because no one slips out from under the net. There's a problem with these annual policies. One is the size of the cover, and the other one is whether those premiums are being paid. So we do prefer the project policies. And unfortunately now, I don't think any can be obtained now. It is a problem.
Okay. And the parties in this matter were based in Spain. Did you encounter any obstacles in dealing with European markets in terms of their approach?
No, in fact, on this particular matter, we went across to Spain, we went across to Seville, and we discussed the failures with the consulting engineers or in-house consulting engineers for Abengoa, who are the main contractors. So we interviewed the engineers, found out why and how the mistakes were made. We had no problem with the people that actually at Abengoa in Spain, and the meetings were attended by Aon in Spain, who were also very helpful, and they explained to the insured what the cover was under the policies. No, we really had no problem. They're very aware in Europe of the cover under these policies, and we really didn't have any problem at all. The Abengoa people were excellent. It really wasn't a problem.
Do you see
Can't hear you.
Sorry. Do you see many
Sorry,
claims?
Dominique.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Okay. Do you see many claims related to solar power plants? And if so, is there a reason why?
We've had quite a few on the solar plant. We've had not on the plant per se. We've just had a very nasty one up in Mali, where they were bringing the panels in. These were photovoltaic panels, and they were set down in a holding area or a laydown area. As they were imported onto site, they put them in this holding area, and then as and when they required them, they took the panels out and installed them on site. They hit some problems with the locals, in fact, when the COVID started. And what happened there was, because of the problem of bringing the people on and off the site, they asked the people to come on and stay on site, and that was a huge problem. And there was a major labor dispute, and in fact, they blockaded the site. And what happened during this dispute, and it's still under discussion, is that someone set fire to the panels in the laydown area, and those panels were burnt out. So that is not really a claim on the panels per se, but it was a very nasty claim, and that claim was well over 100 million to replace those panels. And that one is again under discussion at the moment. So on other power plants, yes, we have had problems we've had problems with a storm down in the Eastern Cape where they knocked out a lot of those panels. And we've had problems also in the Eastern Cape where we've had the problems with the transformers, where these were designed for European conditions and not the heat of South Africa. We've had a problem with overheating of those transformers. Yes, so we've had quite a few claims. We've also had claims for the cabling, again, because of the heat. These cables were buried underground, very difficult to get to if anything went wrong. So what they've done now, they've left all those cables in the ground and they put cable racks on above ground, and they're now relayed all the cables. So yes, we have had ongoing problems, but I mean, you do on a lot of these projects have this kind of problem. But yes, we have had quite a few.
Thank you. I see there's a question from Fiso. Do you want to take now or at the end?
Absolutely, no, far away. I prefer the questions as when they arise.
Oh, as they come.
They're not forgotten.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're not forgotten. Yes, please, fast away.
Hi, Kamini. Hi, Tove and Martin. I just wanted to ask.
Good morning.
I wanted to ask if all the parties were found guilty or at fault in this project, or just the engineer because it was a design error. And in terms of that, how does then the deductible, how does it work? Do we ask all the parties or consultants in the project to pay the deductible, or is it just only the party at fault, which in this case would be the engineer that designed it incorrectly?
No, very good question. On most of these projects, certainly under the PI, you have to find the person at fault. They have to be a professional person, obviously, and it's normally a single person. It's not normally a company. You're not looking to a company. It's the engineer working for that company that you interview, and you find where the engineer has made a professional error. That's what the PI policy comes into force, as you realize. If the engineer has made a professional error or an error of professional nature, then the policy would respond. So we interview the engineers to find out if they have made an error, and they can discuss it with us. Nothing's put down in writing, and we discuss that with them, and that then goes in part of our report. So no, you don't look for it normally, or very unusual to have more than one engineer involved in that error. It's normally a single engineer.
Thank you. Okay, you can move on to the next claim.
Martin, there is one other question on the chat. So the question is, was there an issue regarding the actual loss? So did the damage actually materialize, or was it a fear of loss where the damage had not come to light yet?
No, but also a good question there. If it hasn't come to, okay, there's almost two totally separate. Let me answer the first one. Yes, the damage had occurred. What was happening was, and how it was picked up, is that when the panels were rotating, they were juddering. It was not a smooth rotation, and they realized something was catching the shafts. That's when they found. And when they opened up or started opening up, they started finding that damage. So the damage had occurred. So really there was no discussion. One of the questions was going to be asked was the betterment, and that's still something to discuss. What they've done now is put back a better system. Obviously, you take the opportunity to put something better than you had before. So they've changed the design and put something better. If there's no damage, and just has to be replaced, yes, that will still be a PI claim. But on this one, the damage had already occurred, and in fact was ongoing damage as the things rotated every day. So there was ongoing damage to the shaft and bearings.
Thanks, Martin.
Okay.
There is one last question on this particular claim.
Yes.
Have you had PI claims in the SWRO, the desalination plant design, or alternatively the construction process?
Desalination plants have had a claim. We had one in Cape Town, which was not providing sufficient flow through. There was a problem in Cape Town, in fact, that the feed material, the material coming in from the sea, was too highly contaminated. And what they had to then do is put an upfront plant before the desalination plant to take out all the material in the water before it went into the plant. That was not originally allowed for, and that was an extra to the contract. And that, in fact, was a claim against the engineers who should have, the allegation was they should have picked up that the feed water, in fact, was highly contaminated.
Peter, does that answer your question? I think it does, Martin. And then
please,
one
if
final.
they must come back. Please come back if they're not happy with the answer, please.
Yeah. One final one on this particular, on the previous claim, Martin, is how does this differ from a defective workmanship claim?
It's sometimes they almost blend into each other. Sometimes you do have the defective workmanship comes up, but on this particular one, there was no discussion. It was clearly a design error. They did not design the shaft on which the panels rotated correctly. What they did, they designed a shaft which had some thread on it, and the thread interfered with the bearing, and it should have been a machined shaft. So it was purely a design defect. But you sometimes get where there is a workmanship problem as well as a design problem, and you have to differentiate between those two. So if they're claiming under a PI claim, and there is you exclude that if it's a workmanship problem, that comes out. And sometimes you get two policies. You sometimes get the PI policy in conjunction with a CAR policy, both, and sometimes you divide the claim between the CAR and I think later on in our discussion, we raised between the CAR and the PI, and we'll discuss that when we get to that question.
Thanks, Martin.
Thank you. Please, any questions, please put them in. Shall I start on this one? Carmen, are you happy? May I go ahead on this one?
Yes, please.
Okay. This was in a new container terminal, which was up in Namibia. What you see here is an artificial island out into the sea. And on the left there is the new island made up of sand, which is actually where Carmen is now pointing to. And on the right here is where the container cranes on the right, a little bit more to down, that's it. This is where the container cranes are going to be installed, and the ships will then tie up against that quay. So that is the quay structure. And what happens here is they put in 550 piles, and at the time they put those piles in, that whole of that island, that artificial island, extended beyond where you now see the concrete. So it came right out into the sea. They then piled through the island, down through the seabed. In fact, they went down 60 meters and put those piles in. And then they cast what you now see, which is the concrete on top of those piles. Once that concrete was cast, that's right, exactly what the company is showing now. Once that concrete was cast, they then started removing the island away from that quay, which would then allow the ships to tie up against it. When they then removed the sand, it exposed the piles. When the piles are put through the island, you couldn't see them, they just went down to the sand. But when they took the sand away to allow the ships to tie up, they found, and I think the next picture will show quite clearly, what they found here. Now, I don't know how many engineers are listening, but what you see here, and this is pictures we took underwater, and what you see here is a reinforcing steel, which forms the center of these piles. Now, when you look at a pile, you only see the concrete. So what's happened here, when they cast the concrete of the piles, the concrete didn't go through the reinforcing steel. That steel should be encased in at least 100 millimeter thick concrete to protect the steel. So when they cast the concrete, it only went inside the steel cage and didn't come through the steel. So that steel is totally unprotected. And every single pile that they opened up looked like this. So there was a major failure with the pouring of these concrete piles. Carmen, if you can just go one back. Is that possible? Am I pushing technology? Okay, that's great. We've gone one backwards. So those piles are at the corner of every single one of those beams. So they go down both sides of that key wall. Because of this, there was no way of rectifying those piles. Those piles were defective and they had to replace all 550 piles. They put in piles in between the existing piles. It cost about 850 million to put in the new piles. Now, they lodged claims both under the PI and under the CAR. But unfortunately, under the PI, they only had 50 million cover, whereas the claim was 850 million. So they then really pursued the claim under the works policy, which will give them full cover if the policy responded. So really what happened here, because in their mind, only 50 million, I know people listening here, 50 million is a lot of money, but if you're looking for 850 million, it doesn't really make much of an impact. So the claim under the PI policy slowly drifted away and they pursued it under the works policy. We did both of these claims. We did under both the works and the PI, and neither policy responded. So in fact, the contractor was left with a loss here of 850 million rand. So that's what happened with this particular claim. Okay, you're going to ask some questions now, Carmen.
Yeah.
Hello, Martin. Morning, everyone. Martin,
Good morning.
My first question to you, is it common to find engineers making the same errors frequently?
Yes, we do have that, and it is a problem that it would appear there's a disconnect between the claims departments in many cases and the underwriting department. So yes, we do get the same engineers making the same errors, not the same errors, making errors on a number of occasions, but the policy is simply renewed. So yes, there's a couple of engineers who've made the errors over and over again, and those policies just kept every year, and they come up again, and we go through the same problem again. Not the same type of claim, but the same errors again. Yes, we do have that.
In your opinion, what is it that an insurer can do when insuring an engineer? What can they do to reduce the exposure? In some cases, some insurers opt to cancel the policy, decrease limits. Is there something that an insurer can do?
Yes, I think we must just take the policy away for the moment. All claims are dependent on the contracts. So you look at the contract first. So if the engineer, let's say his fees are R1 million, and he enters into what we call a standard agreement, which would be something like a proxy agreement or a CISA agreement. Under those agreements, they limit their liability normally to twice their fees, and they contract out to consequential losses. So when we have a proxy agreement or a CISA agreement, then we know there is a limit of his liability, regardless of the policy. The policy doesn't come in at that point. So we really prefer that the engineer enters into a formal contract. And in fact, I only had a claim on Friday. Again, it was not quite the back of a cigarette packet, but it was an agreement that was really very wide, very loose. And we really asked through the broker, and every engineer we come up against with this problem, we ask them to formalize their contracts. And it's quite often that they get in with a client, and they've been with that client for year after year, and it's a very loose arrangement, which is fine unless there's a claim. And as soon as a claim comes up, then you find that that so-called loose arrangement doesn't work. So yes, I think rather than, obviously, if you get claim after claim, you want to either cancel the policy, whatever. But I think the main thing is to look at the contracts they're entering into and have it watertight. They have a contract, they have a limit of liability, they're contracted out of consequential losses. Therefore, they know what their limits are. Okay. And I think the insurer should really say to their insured, make quite sure on every single contract, and the broker as well, every contract, if you went into a formal agreement. That's really the most important thing.
That's important. In your opinion, is there any particular discipline of engineering where there's been a high frequency of claims?
It's quite a hard one to answer because I'm a civil engineer. So we really only do civil engineering claims. So, I don't, we also do architects and QSs. So, but on the mechanical engineering side, I'm sure there's a lot of claims on the mechanical engineering side, but I don't get involved in it. I only see the civil. So the civil engineering looks very bleak, but I'm quite sure if you look across the mechanical engineering, it's just the same situation. But I don't do those kind of claims. So sorry, I can't answer you.
Thank you, Martin.
Absolutely my pleasure, Nadia.
Nadia, Martin, we've got a few other questions related to that claim. Rob Hellier, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and ask the question.
Hi, Martin. Thanks very much.
Hello,
I was just surprised. Why? Surely when those columns were delivered, they could see that the reinforcing was on the outside and not encased with concrete. And why did they proceed?
These are what they call a cast in situ pile. So what you do is you drill down the 60 meters and you put in a temporary steel casing down the full length of the pile. Then what you do is you insert it in the cage, the reinforcing cage, you slide it down inside that casing, and then you start pouring the concrete through the steel into the bottom of the pile. And you use a thing called a tremie pipe. And what that is a long pipe goes to the bottom with a funnel on top. And as you pour the concrete, so you slowly withdraw the pipe and you slowly withdraw the outside casing. So you pull out the pipe and you pull out the casing as you cast the concrete.
Okay.
So no, you don't deliver a 60-meter pile to site. They're actually cast on the site.
So with that in mind, I mean, would it be reasonable for an insurer to insist that in something like that they do quality control, or they check after they've done 20 piles, they go down there and they check and they make sure that everything is working according to plan? Could we insist on that?
I would say, Rob, I think after a couple of piles, you could start doing that to make sure that they're doing the right process. I just don't know whether the insurer can do that, because if you get too involved in the actual method of casting or the method of construction, the insurer the insurers don't have that, I'm saying that loosely, don't have that kind of technical departments to do that kind of work. And if you go and check every single building and every single construction, you'll need a vast number of people in the insurance company to go out and check. So you're depending on the consulting engineers on the site and the contractor being competent to do that work. So only once a failure occurs, you can go out there.
Yeah, and I'm not proposing the insurer do it. I'm proposing that the insurer place the burden along the lines of what Nadia was asking earlier. Can we place the burden of quality control checking on either the contractor or the engineer, so that there's a way of detecting error before it becomes catastrophic?
Rob, I'm not disagreeing with you at all, but the onus is placed on the contractor. If you see the standard contract, the JBCC or whatever the contract you're into, the onus is placed on the contractor to be competent. He must do as he's instructed, he must follow the specification. And you're quite right. And the onus also rests with the consulting engineers who are employed by the client to look after their interests as well. So yes, you have two parties there where the onus rests on them to make sure what is being built is correct. And neither of them on this particular one did their job. Okay. But if they did, we wouldn't have any claims. So.
Ideally, wouldn't that be wonderful?
So if everyone did their job, we wouldn't need any policy insurance policies, and more critical, you wouldn't need loss adjusters.
Okay, so we better stay in business then.
Any other
Martin,
questions on the thing? Yeah.
There's plenty of questions on this one, but I think we'll take just one more and then we can come back to the rest if we've got time at the end. Is there a prescription period on the PI claim? So just say the project was done 3 years ago and there's a design issue discovered. Will the standing PI respond if there was cover at the time of the project?
All right. A normal, as you know, and I'm sure there's lawyers listening, your normal prescription period in South Africa is 3 years, unless the policy dictates otherwise. But a design defect does not have a prescription period. It's the time that they find out that there's a design error that is prescription. So if, for instance, 3 or 4 years down the road, they find there's a design error, that can still be made against the engineer. It's at that time the design error is found, you then have 3 years to run. So initially, you don't have a prescription period up to a design defect, but you do after it's discovered.
Yeah, prescription starts running when the debt becomes due. So as Martin says, only when they find out about the issue, that's when the prescription starts running, even though it was done three years ago, however many years ago. But then it would be based on the type of policy you have, whether you have a claims made or losses occurring policy. If it's a claims made policy, then you would have to look at your retro date, etc., to see whether or not you would have cover.
Yes, that's quite correct.
Thank
Any
you.
other questions?
Thanks, Martin. Carmini?
Actually, my pleasure. Any other questions coming in now?
I think we can move on to the Greystone claim.
Okay. All right. Well, for the people who live in Johannesburg, this is what has now become really the famous Greystone Bridge collapse. This is as you know, is a pedestrian and bicycle bridge that links Sandton into Alex. And obviously it's complete. That's what it looks like now. At the time of the event, they had erected the temporary support work just for the center span. So that is a span that just goes over the highway. They erected orange steelwork on which they were going to cast the concrete just for the center spans. And this temporary support was only up for one day when it fell down. And I think the next photograph will show what happened here. So this is the support work you see on the left, and it is just, that's correct, that's absolutely right. That is the temporary support going across the highway. And what happened here, if you can look carefully, if there's an engineer listening, on each end of that, there are single row of supports, and in the center, there's a double row of supports. So yes, that's correct. There's a double row of supports. So the lateral movement, any movement taken laterally was taken up by that double support in the center of the highway. The outside legs didn't provide any lateral support. Yes, those outside legs don't provide any lateral support. So what happened here, in effect, is that the ones in the center there were unable to take any wind loading, and under a fairly minor wind loading, it was blown over because there was nothing to prevent it moving sideways. So I think the next photograph shows it when it actually fell over. That was taken a couple of hours before it fell down. And the next one here where she fell down. Now you can clearly see what happened here. In the front here, there's a taxi here where that's right, the taxi here, where you can see the roof has been taken off to extract the passengers. There were 13 passengers in the back, and there was the driver and a passenger in the front seat. The driver, unfortunately, was impaled and he was killed. The passenger in the front seat was also impaled but survived, although he's in hospital a very, very long time. The 13 passengers, unfortunately, in this country, the passengers in a taxi don't have seatbelts, which is really terrible. So when a taxi stops suddenly, there's nothing preventing all the passengers from being concertinaed into the front. And that's exactly what happened here. So there were lots of broken arms, broken legs, and broken everything because of the passenger who just came to a sudden stop. So all those were taken immediately to hospital. On the other side of the freeway, behind that fire truck, just a little bit higher up and to the right, a little bit, yeah, under that pile there was a Fortuner, which was traveling up from Durban to Pretoria. It had, get it right, it had 5 passengers in. The driver was killed and the other 4 were unharmed, but sitting in that Fortuner under that pile of steel. So we had to extract that Fortuner from under the pile of steel. Just to give you some idea, this fell down at about 4:15 in the afternoon. Thank goodness, just before the rush hour. So there was only these 2 vehicles were hit. We arrived on site about 15 minutes after the event. We worked right through the night and we only left site at 3 o'clock the following afternoon. We only left site once the highway was clear. Is the question coming up? Yes. We had to make quite sure that we recovered everything for a court of inquiry. We knew that would happen because the deaths were involved. So what we tried to do was keep all those large elements in one piece, didn't cut them up with a cutting torch. So you see on the right here, there's a white crane. That's the 300-ton crane. That was not big enough. So what we did, we brought a 400-ton crane in during the night from Wadeville, and all those large segments we've stored each side of the highway. And I think anyone driving up and down for a few weeks after that event saw these stored on the side. We eventually moved that to Western area and we stored it there. So the idea was us being on site, making sure the evidence was not cut up and we recover as much as we possibly could. I don't know, I think that was just those 3 photographs. The claims were then put under the, I'll go through that. Is that question asked? No, it's going to ask. The claims were put under all the policies. It was put under the PI, it was put under the works policy, it was put under the temporary works or plant, and there were a number of engineers involved here. So there was the engineers on the site, there was the engineers involved in the design of that support work, there was the engineers from the contractor. So there was about 5 different groups of engineers involved, plus the contractor, plus the Johannesburg City Council. So there was a lot of parties involved on this matter. You want to ask the questions?
Yes. Good morning, Martin. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Good morning, Jessica. How are you?
Good, and you?
Fine, thank you.
Good. Martin, in your view, why is there an increase in temporary works claims lately?
You're quite right. We have had a lot of temporary works claims. What used to happen in the past is that the contractor would design and direct his own support work. But because of the type of support work now has got far more complicated than we had in the past, what you have now are dedicated temporary works designers. And we have been encouraging the contractors, certainly since Greyston, to employ these type of engineers to design and check temporary support, not just to put up scaffolding, but to design it correctly. And the number of failures, I know it is actually going down now because the temporary works designers are involved. And when we get to a site, we would often ask, has a temporary works designer been appointed? And if not, ask him to just come and check. But yes, there was a lot of, and we still get them, I'm afraid. There are temporary works collapses are still occurring, but you need to appoint a temporary works designer, a dedicated designer to do this work. What happened here, just to give you a little bit of background, and it's public knowledge, that temporary works you see there was drawn by Formscaf. Formscaf was one of the parties involved in this matter. And the drawings were then given to Murray and Roberts, who erected that structural steelwork. But unfortunately, no party actually checked the design. On the Formscaf drawing, and I said this is public knowledge now, on the Formscaf drawing, it states that they don't have in-house designers and the end user must check the design. Murray and Roberts didn't pick that up. They assumed that Formscaf had designed and checked that temporary support, and it hadn't been checked. Okay, and that was one of the main items that came out in the discussion.
Thank you. What inquiries does any insured face when there is a loss of life on site?
There's 2 different, and we don't get involved in the one which is code. And I don't know whether anyone listening in can give us a bit of feedback on that. And that is when someone who is injured or killed is an employee of the contractor. And that is a different type of insurance. On this particular one, because the people who were killed had nothing to do with the contract. So we had a Department of Labour inquiry set up in Pretoria. It's a government setup. And we actually spent 14 days in that inquiry. And that inquiry is attended by all the legal teams for the various parties. And experts are appointed and appear at a Department of Labour inquiry to find out who was at fault. So they have gone through that, and the Department of Labour inquiry has been issued. Finally, it took many years for it to be issued. In fact, we had one, just going back, we had one at the Tongaat Mall, and as far as I know, and that was longer, has still not been issued. But they found against various parties who were at fault on the Greyston Bridge collapse. But as far as I'm aware, no one has actually been taken to court and no one's been summoned on it. And we are now just over 5 years down the road. What is also worrying is that the families for the deceased have not been compensated. And that would have to go, and again, there must be lawyers listening, that would have to go to a civil action, not a Department of Labour. So there'll be a civil action taken against whoever they believe is the guilty party. But those, as far as I know, those have not gone to court yet.
Martin, what risk management strategies could the insurer use to prevent an accident like this from occurring again?
Again, I picked up this. Certainly, what would happen here? Now, you said the insured. Okay, the insured. The insured now, certainly after the Greyston Bridge collapse, the insureds are very aware that if a drawing has been issued and it hasn't been checked by an engineer and signed off by an engineer, it's a piece of paper. It doesn't mean anything unless the drawing is signed and signed off. So the insurers now are very aware of this after Greyston, and the drawings have to be checked to make sure they're being correctly prepared. So, you know, it's always a problem with the insurer. The insurer really can't get involved. Again, we have to depend on the contractor being competent and the consulting engineers to do their work. But yes, certainly going forward, the main thing the insurer has to be very aware of is that the drawings issued are drawings for construction, and a drawing for construction is actually stamped on it. It's stamped across the right-hand corner for construction. If it's issued for information purposes, that drawing can't be used. Only a drawing can be used is for construction. And in fact, we've just had one a couple of days ago where again they went and used a drawing that was not for construction. And it's something that the insured has to be very, very aware of. You can't use a drawing that's not issued for construction. So it's a long answer for a quick question.
What are the complexities or the challenges that an insured may face for triggering the prior to handover section of the policy?
Okay, Stacey, you're asking very long questions, very long. As you know, the PI policy has two separate sections. One is prior to handover, and the second one is after handover. So the policy is divided into two very separate parts. Prior to handover, you just have to find the engineer is liable. After handover, it is now the property of the client, and the client has to institute action against the engineer. Whereas prior to handover, you just have to demonstrate that the engineer has made a mistake. And they're two really different types of claims. And it's almost you need two separate policies, one prior to handover and one post handover. But that's really the difference. Prior to handover, you just have to show the engineer has made a mistake in terms of his professional duties. After handover, it's now the property of the client. He has to institute action against the engineer. So those are the two parts of that policy.
Can you explain the differences between the types of policies that can come into place for one particular claim? For instance, the PI, the plant or risk, and CAR policies.
Stacey, you asked really difficult questions. Okay, these are the three that happened on this particular Greyston Bridge. The one, the PI, was taken because of the different engineers involved from each of the party. There was Royal Haskoning involved as the original engineer. There was a Formscaf engineer, Marion Roberts engineer, etc., and also the engineers from the council. They were involved on that. So the PI policy was triggered by all those various insurers. Most of them were insured under the one insurer, who is the major PI insurer in town. The plant, which is that scaffolding you see there, that will come under a plant policy. And the plant policy you have to be careful that sometimes you tag on a plant policy onto a CAR policy. You tag it on the end, or you have a standalone plant policy. This particular plant policy here was Formscap have a plant policy, but in terms of the hire agreement, they instructed Marion Roberts to also insure the plant. So the plant policy was a Murray Roberts policy, and there was a minor damage to the works. There was very little works damage. There was a bit of concrete, etc., and that was covered under a CAR, or contractors all risks, taken again out by Murray Roberts. So on this particular, you had the three policies running together. Any other questions?
Not from my side. Thank you.
Oh, okay, thanks, Stacey.
Christopher, sorry, Martin, we've got one question from Christopher Shorter, who's listening in from the Teams
Only
chat.
one, wow.
And Christopher says, how do qualified engineers and companies make such errors when something like the wind or insufficient support could cause an inevitable failure?
Yes, it's Christopher, it's a very good question, Christopher. How can, again, if they don't, we wouldn't be in business, but yes, how can they make such an error? What happened on this particular one, and it's almost a sequence of errors. It's, again, when Formscap did the original drawing, they showed the scaffolding, including the section over the highway, to go right across the bridge, starting at one abutment and right across to the other abutment. A decision was taken between Formscap and Murray Roberts just to put the section over the highway. Now, what should have happened at that point, because you've changed the original drawing, which was right across, and now you're only doing it over the highway, they should have gone back to the engineer and said, because we're not putting the rest of the scaffold, is the piece over the highway sufficiently rigid that it won't fall over? That question was never asked. So again, the engineer, in our opinion, should have seen that in fact they were only putting this section over the highway and it would not have sufficient support. To compound that error, as I said before, Formscap did the original drawing but didn't do the design, and said that on the drawing, the design must be checked by the end user, which was Murray Roberts. Murray Roberts didn't pick that up, that they had to check the design. They assumed incorrectly that Formscap had also done the design. So it was an absolute comedy of errors, which ended up in 2 fatalities. It's very bad. And this is often the case, that it happens like this. A comedy of errors, you end up with this kind of fatality, and it's very sad.
Yeah.
Christopher, yes, how could they make mistakes? But everyone makes mistakes, but these kind of mistakes should not be made. This is, yeah.
Yeah. And Martin, to follow on to that question, FISA is asking, do they not undertake relevant stress tests prior to installing the structures?
You wouldn't do a stress test. A stress test is normally only in the final product, not on temporary works. Temporary works design, you know the capability of all these sections. I mean, it's set out in all the manuals what these will take, what loads they would take. The actual structure you see that's fallen down there, that structure would have taken the concrete. There was no problem with that. The problem was that that structure was not supported on each end to stop it flopping over. So the actual structure itself could have taken the load, but there was no lateral restraint. So it wasn't as much a stress, it was a way of, a method of erecting this which was incorrect. They in isolation erected over the highway, and they didn't allow for any lateral restraint. So that's where the problem came up. So it wasn't a stress per se.
Thanks, Martin. There's another one from Peter. Peter's saying he believes that the Murray and Roberts engineer managing the contract wasn't suitably qualified, went on leave when the collapse occurred, leaving a candidate engineer in charge. And he says, surely this was the final nail.
Peter, you've got a very good insight into this one. Well done. Yes, you are correct. There was a very young engineer involved on the matter. A young engineer was suitably qualified, but he had not built bridges before. So, and I think here is the size of the contract was not particularly large. It was 130 odd million. So it was a relatively small, and I think what was not picked up by the parties was, although the contract was relatively small, you're building over the busiest highway in Africa. And therefore, I think you needed a very senior person to do that, and not a junior engineer. No, so the junior engineer, a really good chap, just did not have the experience. not big out. But you know, the other engineers actually came to site when that center section was put over the highway, and the Engineering Council of South Africa, EGSA, has in fact written to 5 engineers, and they're going to be holding inquiry to each of those engineers. So what the final outcome against the engineers is going to be, I'm not sure at this stage. But EGSA, they certainly were sitting in the Department of Labour inquiry, and they have all the evidence. We don't know. Nothing has followed those letters. Just been a letter to the engineers saying we're going to be holding inquiry ourselves, but nothing's followed that since. But you're right, that's exactly what did happen.
Thank you.
Any other one?
Nope, we can move on to the
Okay.
PwC Towers.
Move on to the next one. All right. This is PwC Towers. This is in Waterfall, just up the road from where we are, in the Waterfall estate, just in Midrand. And this was, like, as you see, a slightly spiral building, PwC building. And this is very, very common in places like Dubai. I think, under correction, this is the first one we actually built in South Africa where we twisted the building. So the thing is complete, but during the construction, they built the lift shaft. Now, the lift shaft in the center can't twist. The lift shaft has to go straight up. So once you built the straight lift shaft, then the floors then rotate around that straight lift shaft. That's what it was done. When they finished the lift shaft and they started the floors, I think they were up to about the 5th or 6th floor at the time, Schindler from Germany arrived to install the lifts. And what they then do is they use laser beams down the lift shafts to get the correct angles, and then they put in the structural steelwork within the lift shaft, and then the cages or the lift cars then run up and down the steelwork. When Schindler arrived and they put it on the lasers down that lift shaft, they found the lift shaft itself had rotated. So not only the building rotated, but the lift shaft has as well. And that obviously caused a lot of consternation. Schindler, we actually spoke to Schindler and said, can't the lift cars just rotate as they go up? So they looked at us quite horrified and went back to Germany. So we then have to rectify that lift shaft. And if you go to the next photograph, not an easy photograph to see, but we're looking up the lift shaft. We're partially up the building, we're looking up the lift shaft. Now those lifts, if you look on the right-hand side, you've got your little pointer there. Yeah, there. Go back a bit, a little bit more to the right, a little bit more to the right, the other right. Come back a bit. Yeah, there. The lifts run up in that cavity. There are 9 lifts, so there's 9 cavities. That's one of them. Come down a bit to this next one. Just, yeah, that's right. So that's right there. So the lift also runs up there. So there's 9 lifts running up here. And this whole structure you're looking up here had rotated slightly and didn't allow the lifts to be installed. So what we had to do then is make a decision. We looked at making the lifts smaller, so they will fit in the distorted openings, but the department, who was it, the fire department, wouldn't allow to do that because they had sufficient number of lifts to take the people out of the building. They wouldn't allow them to make the lift smaller. So what we then had to do is demolish all that concrete you see in front of you there, except for the columns. So all these beams running across, all those were demolished, the whole height of the building. We then had to put in structural steel beams and bolt them back into place. The demolition and the reconstruction of that shaft was in the region of about 25 million. But we worked right through the holidays. We worked day and night. So there would not be a delay on the contract. And in fact, it was completed in time. So it was a very interesting claim, caused a lot of disputes, but that was a very interesting matter. Why the lift shaft rotated, we're still not entirely sure. It was what you call slid or sliding shutter, which you slide the shutter as you pour the concrete, and that shutter is controlled by vertical lasers. We have all the laser data, which shows that it was straight. but it certainly wasn't straight when it was finished. We're not sure actually what happened here. We actually don't know why it rotated. And it rotated quite a bit. It rotated about 300 millimeters. Certainly far greater than the tolerance. I think the tolerance was 70 millimeters, and it was 300 millimeters out. So that was the PwC building.
Okay, so Martin, you had touched a bit on contracts earlier, and I think it's always great that we emphasize the importance of having the right contracts in place. In your experience, what is the most effective contract in place to manage and insure its risk on the project?
I think if it's a PI policy, then I think we would very much go with a PROXA or go with a CISA standard form agreements. For the PI, we really want that. Under the CAR, and it was brought up earlier, you have so many different contracts. You had the JBCC standard contract, really for the building kind of contracts, or the smaller contracts. And then you had the FIDIC, the various FIDIC green books and red books, etc., and white books. So there are very much standard contracts in place, and a lot of them have been tested, or the clauses have been tested in court cases. So we know what they say. And we really do encourage, certainly the insureds, not to change those original contracts, leave them in place. Therefore, they say it's a FIDIC or JBCC. We don't have to read them again. We know what they say. If you want to change a clause, then you put it in the special conditions at the back. So you say delete clause 12.1 and replace it with this wording. Therefore, when we come to read a contract, we don't have to read the whole contract. We just have to go to the specials and see what the two parties have agreed to. And it's normally in the specials that you see where the client or the contractor or the engineer has taken out the policy. So when we get that contract, we immediately go to the specials to see what their parties have agreed to. If you go, for instance, to a SASL contract, then SASL will insure. They'll take out a policy insuring all the parties. Whereas the smaller contracts, you tend to have the contractor or the engineers having to insure their own work themselves. So don't change the original contract, leave it as is, put in the specials, and then we only have to read the specials. We don't have to read the whole contract. And we had that some time ago with a broker that they said it was a FIDIC, they gave him the FIDIC, but what they'd done, they changed the wording in the FIDIC. So that the broker got caught because he didn't insure the client correctly, because he assumed that the FIDIC hadn't been changed, and it was the wrong assumption. So you mustn't change that original contract, just put it under special conditions. Sorry, long answer to a quick question.
Thank you, Martin. I think that's going to be very helpful for most insureds. So my last question to you is, can you describe the difficulties in negotiating a claim when there aren't any adequate contracts in place?
Yeah, very difficult. And we get that all the time. This certainly, as I said previously, where they have had a client relationship for a very long time, they get laissez-faire, they get fairly relaxed that they know the client so well, which is fine. If the contract is going really well and there's no argument, you can do that type of agreement. But you really must put a contract in place that if something does go wrong, that if you're going into a mediation or arbitration, then the clause are set down in the contract. It sets down what your limited liability, it sets down your duties. So, if you have been working or the insurance has been working with someone for a long time, you must still renew the contract, still give in place. You're not going to upset the client by doing that. It just, both parties then know what their duties are and their responsibilities are. So keep those contracts in place and make sure that the broker is aware of those contracts and aware the cover he requires. And we get a lot now. I've just had one literally Wednesday last week, where it was really no contract. It was just a buying order to say, do the next job for us, do the next design for us. Now it's gone wrong, and it's really going to be difficult to sort out. So yes, if it's not in place, the claim is very difficult. And in many cases, or some cases, the claim is declined because they haven't set out adequately their duties and responsibilities. So that contract must be in place.
Thank you, Martin.
Tori, I see that we're now out of time.
Oh, we've run out of time.
We've run out of time.
Yes, we have. Comedy, I've put it on the chat that we'll carry on for about 5 more minutes. So to take in the last two claims, and then if there are any questions, we'll just post the recording on the YouTube channel. So if anybody needs to leave, this will be posted on the YouTube channel, but we'll stay on another 5 to 6 minutes.
All right, this next one, this is a shopping mall in Pretoria that collapsed during the construction, and there was one fatality here. He was a foreman working for the contractor, and the next photograph, I think, shows the collapse. Here we are. All right. So what's happened here? This was a new parkade for the Pick and Pay shopping centre. That was on the top there. That's an existing block of flats, and these columns that you see in front of you supported 2 floors of parkade. And at the time of the event, they had put the steelwork in for the first floor, and they were casting the concrete on top of the steelwork for the second floor. So this concrete you see where the little pointer is was sitting on top of those columns, was sitting right on top there. Right, keep going, top of the columns. Keep going there. Yeah. So that floor you see lying on the ground was sitting on top of those columns, supported on structural steelwork. And while they were casting the concrete, the entire parkade collapsed to the ground. The person who was killed was standing on top of those columns and was flicked off onto the ground below. He fell about 12 meters onto the ground. During our investigation here, we were appointed by the CAR insurers on this matter here. And during our investigations, we found, and we appointed some experts, we found that the design of the structural steelwork on which the concrete was cast was totally inadequate. It was not designed correctly, and the support. Now, if I can, Gary, just bring the pointer down to this column right in front here, if you can. Yes, there, that's right. Now you see, yeah, you can see those holes there. Leave that there, that's absolutely spot on. You see those holes there. What was in those holes were bolts on which the structural steel was supported. And those bolts were totally inadequate to take the structural steel. And in fact, they just pulled out of the concrete and allowed the entire structure to collapse. It was fortunate in a way that it collapsed now, very unfortunate one death, but very fortunate collapse now and not at such, because it would have collapsed. It would have collapsed when it was put into operation, and by that stage it was being used with motor cars. So it was very fortunate when it came down now, it was at an early stage and not in use. So what's happened now under the works policy, the policy pays out for damage, and there's obviously damage here. So there's no argument it's been damaged. We exclude the defective part. So the CRR insurers have paid for all that concrete and replacing these columns. What they haven't paid for is the structural steelwork which was incorrectly designed. What will now happen, they've paid out the contractor, the insurers for the works will now institute action against the consulting engineers to recover the money. Again, there's a Department of Labour inquiry because there's been one death. So that has already occurred. I'm good to, I think the next one shows to the right-hand side of this structure. I think if I remember. The next photograph, sorry, Connie, the next photograph.
Oh, those were all the photographs.
No, that's all right. Okay, next one. Okay, so just go back on that one. So that is what we paid for so far. We paid for we paid under the works policy, and now we're instituting action for the recovery. Oh, that's right. That was the next one I was looking for. Okay, so the first one was on the left there. This is now on the right. You can see how these slabs have collapsed right down onto the ground. Some of the columns have been pushed over. You see this column on the right-hand side, it's leaning over. It's been pushed over with the concrete when it collapsed. You can see that lying over. So that is what happened there. And I say we are now in the process of trying to get some of our money back. Questions?
Martin, how important is timeous notification to the insurer when an incident of this nature happens on site? And what are the consequences when an insurer is notified too late?
This is very important. Certainly on this one here, and on Greyston, the one we had just now, it's absolutely vital that we get out there as soon as possible so that the demolition teams don't come in there and destroy evidence that we will need. So if Greyston, for instance, had been cleared up, cut up and cleared up, we would have great difficulty in establishing actually what took place. Here, because nothing was touched before we arrived, we could take not only these photographs, we could get a cherry picker and we could go up and actually have a look at those holes where the bolts were pulled out. So we could establish fairly early on what had actually happened. We then check it. We then check the design and verify that is what occurred. But it is vitally important to be early as possible on a claim like this. Some claims can be longer. Some claims can be a couple of weeks. It's not going to make a huge difference. But a claim like this, absolutely vital that we get out there as soon as possible. Very, very important.
Okay, and thank you, Martin. And following on that question, what measures should an insured immediately take when an accident like this happens on site?
On this particular, the contractor must immediately cordon off the site. And these contractors are very good contractors, Zenza Construction. They are obviously aware of this. So they keep everyone off the site. With a death, obviously the police are notified, the ambulance arrives, and then cordon the site off. So no one accesses. It's a very dangerous site. I mean, look how those slabs are lying at one angle. It's a very, very dangerous site. You can't go near that site. So you've got to cordon the site off, make sure there's no access to that site until instructions have been received from the department that you can access the site. In fact, to access this site, I think it took 2 weeks before the Department of Labour would allow us to go onto the site. We could take all these pictures, we could go and have a look at, but we couldn't actually go onto the site. And rightly so, a very dangerous situation here. Greyston, we got the okay immediately because it was lying on the highway to clear that debris off. If that had been lying on the site, it would have stayed there, but we had to open the M1 highway. So that's also vital that we retain as much of that structure for future identification of that defect as possible. So we just literally put it to one side, and if anyone remembers, it was stacked up on the banks for some weeks. So very important. Yeah. What measures should be taken immediately? Just notify everyone. Just get everyone involved. Don't touch anything after an event like this.
Thanks, Martin. Next one. Shall we move on?
All right, this one here. Have we got time for this one, or we've run out of time?
You guys want to carry on till 15:15?
Okay.
I think if Martin, you're available, let's carry on.
Yes, no, that's fine. This was a warehouse fire down in Durban. The warehouse belonged to Transnet. In fact, it was the largest warehouse in the Southern Hemisphere. I think it was 250,000 square meters. And what happened here was that Transnet, as the lessor, leased out this building to a single individual, a single company, who then leased it out to 5 other individual companies. In terms of the lease they entered into, and this is very important, again, it's going back to the contracts. In terms of the lease they entered into with Transnet, they had to maintain this warehouse. And what they then did at the time of the event, they were replacing all the sheeting, both on the side and on the top of this warehouse. And while the on the roof had been replaced, sheeting. Outside sheeting, a piece of sticking out, and was in the way of putting the sheeting. So they asked someone just to cut it off. Now, the contractor could have cut it off. He was going away to get a cutting torch to cut it off. But the lessee had a little maintenance team on site who were there at the time. And the lessee said to the contractor, I'll just get my guys to cut it off. So they brought a cutting torch and they cut it off. Stored immediately inside that warehouse, right where they did the cutting, was over 20 tons of wax belonging to Sasol. So when the cutting took place, that wax ignited, and that's really what started the fire. I think the next one shows a bit more.
I don't think there's a next one.
There's anything in this one. All right, I thought there was. No, there isn't. Let me go back. Okay, that's right. So what happened here, virtually the entire warehouse was destroyed. The claim came in at about 5 billion, which was the building, which is just over 1 billion, and about 4 billion rands worth of contents in that. We were asked to go under a works policy, and they issued the policy including surrounding property. We advised insurers we did not believe that even though they took premium, we did not believe that the warehouse was a surrounding property, as it was not under the care, custody and control of the contractor. It was a warehouse very much in use, fully operational, so it was not under the care, custody and control. So under surrounding property, we suggested it wasn't covered. And as far as I'm aware, it was not paid out. It was paid out by the assets insurers who had cover for that building. What happens to the claims for the contents? We weren't involved, so I don't know what happened to the claim for the contents. Any questions?
Yes, Martin. The identification of the scope of work for most construction professions, including the engineering profession, has not yet been gazetted. Once the identification of work has been published, could that have an impact on our policies, and how?
Yes, it could do. We haven't seen it either, so I don't know what they're going to gazette there. But yes, the brokers are very aware of that, and I'm sure they're going to come to the PI insurers should there be anything or more onus placed on their engineers. Things do change. Certainly change because of the claims, and the department is aware these claims have occurred, and in many cases been loss of life. So yes, things are going to change. What is going to change on the policy, I'm not sure, because the policies are very much dependent on a professional error, and I don't think that's going to change. You still have to find out that there is a professional error on the part of someone who is suitably qualified. I don't think that's going to change, but what onus is going to be placed on an engineer, I'm not quite sure in what's going to come up from the government.
Thank you. Can you briefly provide the differences between EPC and EPCM contracts?
EPC, engineering, procurement and construction contracts. The M at the end is management. So you have an EPC contract, which is run by a contractor, and EPCM, which is the M on the M for management. The client can do the management themselves. So they will appoint a separate company, separate firm of engineers to do the management of the project, or project managers to manage the contract. Or they can say to the contractor, we want an entire package, including the management, which is an EPCM, okay? So the contractor would have an in-house project management team who would run the project. A lot of the big companies, I'm thinking of the Sasol and the Escoms, they do the end themselves, they do the management themselves and let the contractor do the construction work, all right? It then divides that responsibility and has an overview, an oversight from a separate company over the contractor. So the contractor will do the design, procurement, and construction. We'll have this overriding view from an outside company on the management of that. And I think it's slightly better to have a separate company, not to wrap it all up in one, but that's the difference between an EPC and an EPCM. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Yes.
Any questions, or everyone gone home now?
There's still a lot of people here.
No, there are lots of people that are still here. And Margie Ellison that says that she loves listening to you always, and she'll stay until the end. And I think that was our very last claim.
Yes.
That's our last claim. That's our last claim. Yes, incorrect.
Yes, yes. So, Carmody, I think we can wrap up.
Yes, thank you everybody for being on the call with us, and thank you so much, Martin, for sharing with us. We really appreciate you.
No, thank you, and thank you to everyone for listening who hasn't fallen asleep. Thank you very much indeed.
No, Martin, there's lots of appreciation for you on the Teams chat. There's lots of it on the Zoom as well. And people are saying they've enjoyed the session, they've learned a lot, and they hope you'll be back again soon, giving us more insights into claims.
It will only be a pleasure to everyone. And thank you everyone again for listening.